Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and welcome to this week's broadcast.
Hello, everyone. This is an important one. David called me while the hearings were on in the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives.
On December 4th, because there's been more
since. There have been several,
yeah.
and said, we should record. I'm recording these. We should excerpt these and make comments on them for the show. And it was a great idea, David.
No small task when they went on for how many hours.
I know you went to some trouble to do all of that.
But not really trouble because I know you both of us are just fascinated to watch this unfold. It's so important. And it also involves these gentlemen that we talk about every week.
So Jonathan Turley is George Washington University School of Law. And I should say as a historical note, he's the cautious one who says, let's slow down, let's wait, that we're rushing here. And I should say that back when Bill Clinton was up to no good, he was 100% for impeachment and removal. And so he has reversed his positions, and it leaves him open to the charge of partisanship, that he was so eager to get rid of Bill Clinton for lying to a grand jury about his sexual life. And now he is so reluctant to condemn President Trump for his public actions with respect to Ukraine. I found that a little bit disquieting, but I was taken with his arguments.
If you watched him on television, I don't know that you had a chance to, but if you watched him, his body language towards the end was pretty obvious. Sitting stiff, arms folded, locked in. To be fair, he was outnumbered.
Well, Alan Dershowitz, who is a very distinguished Harvard alum, and he has been a civil libertarian from day one and consistent. And his view is that this is not okay, that we're making a terrible mistake here, that we need a better reason to impeach and remove from office than we have. And he says he has been ostracized by the liberal community that he has spent the last 5 or 6 decades with. He was the hero of the civil libertarian movement for most of his life, and now that he is using the same standards to defend Trump that he used to defend others earlier in American history, he's really taken a lot of social heat. And so all of us have to remember, it's so hard, we have to remember that none of us approaches this objectively, that the Trumpites and the right and the conservatives and the Republican Party see this through a certain lens, and it's not an objective lens. And the left or the House Democrats or the pro-impeachment people see this through another lens. And you really need someone from Jupiter who has no stake in this to look at this and say, well, from our reading of the Constitution that you all wrote and ratified back in 1788, it would appear to be X and Y and Z. This is the conclusion we would draw.
May I respond?
Yeah, sure.
We both lived through Watergate and the Nixon, almost impeachment. You keep referring to that no one has been removed from office in impeachment, but Nixon undoubtedly would have been.
We think so. We think so.
I just, I look back at testimony from that time, and, it's real easy to throw up our hands and say, yes, they see it through this lens, they see it, and never the twain shall meet. But we just seem to have an absence of statesmen who can stand up and say, your side is wrong, but so is mine, and here's the middle. And I just believe that middle exists. I'm not saying that you could strike that middle and change everyone's mind on both sides. But it just seems like leadership, we're lacking statesmanship and oratory skills to be able to find the middle and say, let's talk, not just shout.
Well, who thought that Mitt Romney would wind up being a hero in this story, but he is. I believe that we do lack nonpartisan statesmanship. I think that this is about the Constitution, not about either of the existing political parties. And I think that both sides have gotten a little too deeply wrapped up in their own approach to this. But I think, frankly, most of the fault is now on the Republican side. because it is absolutely clear to me that the President of the United States put terrible pressure on a national security emergency defense fund for Ukraine, held back that money for the specific purpose of forcing them to cooperate in his desire to bring down the candidacy of Joe Biden, and that is an appalling breach at all sorts of levels, and that has to be acknowledged. And what I want to hear is Republicans saying, we get it. It stinks. It was a horrible thing that he did. He shouldn't have done it. It's bad. It's really bad. It's really, really bad. Now, whether it in the end means we should remove him from office is another question.
Well, Turley kind of said that.
He did,
in his
and
opening
I
statement.
appreciated that. He said we're mad. We hate it. We talk about it. We don't like what he's done. He shouldn't have done it. It wasn't a perfect call. It was a highly imperfect call. But I want scores of Republicans to say, of course we get it. Of course we get it, that this was a really bad thing that the president did.
Well, in weeks to come, there'll be more in the Senate, and we'll see how that all plays out.
But that's what you want in this situation. And in the end, you have to decide. You have to decide. You, David Swenson, I, others, everyone listening has to decide. Let's just say we all stipulate the facts that there was an ultimatum put on Ukraine. You want that money? You better cooperate here in helping to bring down the Biden candidacy. Let's say we could all agree on that, and we should, because it seems to me that it is absolutely crystal clear. Then the question is, okay, if we agree that it's a bad thing, does that rise to the level of impeachment and removal? I think that's an interesting debate.
I think that there's more of a bottom line question, and that is, does the president recognize that it was wrong? I don't think he does. I think he thinks, as he said, that call was perfect. I don't think Trump recognizes what he did was wrong. And I agree with you. I think most people can agree that is not something we should do.
So if they can agree, they should acknowledge it, even if they're going to defend him. I do think you're right. I think that for whatever reason, Donald Trump thinks they all do it. You get what advantage you can in the world.
He's a real estate guy. He's a businessman. He's not a professional politician who recognizes that there are parameters. He's in charge. He's the boss. He can do what he wants. And
I'm with Jefferson. You know when you're when you're doing an unethical thing. You know when you're doing an unethical thing. And I think it was Professor Carlin who said, let's say that a hurricane has hit Texas, and the governor of Texas calls the president and says, we really need some help here. And the president said, yeah, I'm going to release some FEMA money to you, but I need a favor, though. I need you to attack my political opponent. And when I see that you have attacked my political opponent, then probably I'll release the aid. It's a perfect analogy.
Let's get to the show. I want to compliment you on your essay this week. I thought it was brilliant.
Thank you.
I'm hoping people will listen to the show and not just jump to your essay. But
can I say, the Lewis and Clark Cultural Tour in June, we are now taking reservations. The Lewis and Clark Wendover Death March, Canoeing on the Missouri, the cultural tour, is in June, late June, of 2020, and we're now taking reservations, and I want people to come on that tour. It's the highlight of my year. You can forget about Donald Trump and Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky and George W. Bush and Herbert Walker Bush and the Congress and the Supreme Court, and you just immerse yourself in the America of Lewis and Clark for 10 days, and it is paradise on earth.
Two things on that.
Yes, sir.
One is there is a gentleman that gets pretty offended when you call it the Wendover Death March. It's really not. He's
offended because he knows what a death march means.
Right. It's a strenuous hike. But the other is that we get a lot of email inquiries about this. So people that are interested, jeffersonhour.com/tours. Yeah, and go there. You can support the show. We love that. We appreciate that. And you can also ask a question of the president, and we read every one. And we need to wish Mason a good night's sleep. And my apology to those who have relatives who survived or didn't survive the Bataan Death March. Sorry I brought it up, but I thought I should. But that's all said in jest. And yes, of course. And this was a fun exercise this week, and I hope that people find it worthwhile and helpful because, as I said, there are very few of us who have 6 or 7 or 8 hours to sit and watch these hearings. So this by no means is a complete exchange, but it does give you some of the highlights.
What they said was a fabulous lesson in civics, and
Yes.
I was so impressed by them, and that they played right into our hands. Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Mason, the Founding Fathers, the Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers, even Alexander Hamilton, of all people. It was like music to my ears to hear somebody in Congress finally say something about the founding generation.
Great conversation this week, and without sucking up too much, you were brilliant. And
Oh,
I thank
you're
you
very
for that.
kind.
So,
Thank you. And thanks for setting up this show, my friend. And happy holidays to everyone.
The House Committee on the Judiciary will come to order.
The impeachment power really is about the preservation of our democratic systems. And the question we must answer is whether the activity of the president threatens our Constitution and our democracy. And it's about whether he's above the law and whether he's honoring his oath of office.
Hello, everyone. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of character today. And sitting across from me is my friend David Swenson. We are in the fourth impeachment crisis in American presidential history. On Wednesday, December 4th, 2019, the House Impeachment Committee had a hearing in which 4 distinguished law professors, 4 experts in the United States Constitution, testified and tried to provide some advice about whether the actions of the sitting president of the United States, Donald Trump, rose to the level of impeachment. It was a very long day of testimony, at times acrimonious, always fascinating. And so what we've done at the Jefferson Hour is go in and bring out a few of the most extraordinary moments from the testimony of the 4 individuals in question. Noah Feldman of Harvard Law School, Pamela S. Carlin of Stanford's Law, Michael Gerhardt from the University of North Carolina School of Law, and Jonathan Turley from the George Washington University Law School. So we're going to play those excerpts for you and stop after each one to provide some commentary from a Jeffersonian point of view. So David, welcome to this really, I have to say, not only special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, but an edition of the Jefferson Hour at a critical moment in American history.
it's a unique opportunity because we have 4 distinguished people that we can hear from and get their perspective on constitutional law and on impeachment. And it's also quite relevant to the Thomas Jefferson Hour because the founders are quoted and referenced so often in this testimony.
And I'll tell you what I have concluded from the beginning, and that is that the impeachment clause is a very problematic article. And it has caused enormous confusion in the course of American history. And as you know, 2 previous presidents have been impeached. Andrew Johnson, right after the Civil War, and William Jefferson Clinton in the 1990s. And in each case, there was an acquittal. The Senate of the United States, sitting as the jury, weighing the evidence in an impeachment trial, in both cases decided not to remove the individual in question. In the third case, that of Richard Milhouse Nixon in 1973 and 1974, the House of Representatives had voted articles of impeachment, but they had not yet presented them to the Senate. And before that could happen, Richard Nixon resigned, the only president in American history to resign. Those are the 3 previous cases: Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton. And in none of those cases was there a trial in the United States Senate that led to the eviction of the sitting president of the United States. That should tell you something. It tells you, first, that the bar is very, very, very high. And secondly, that it may be, and this is my conclusion, that it is effectively impossible to reach a 2/3 majority in the United States Senate to impeach any individual, no matter what his behavior or her behavior has been.
Before we get into playing these sound bites, I would like to point out that we are having this conversation on the 9th of December, and things are moving so rapidly. Who knows? This will be broadcast about a week from now, and who knows what will have happened in the next 7 days. Regardless of what happens, I think this discussion is important, and I, like many Americans, I'm certain did not have the luxury of taking an entire day off and listening to all this testimony. So hopefully this will provide some context for people who didn't have that time.
Of course, and I do think that it's very important. I was fascinated. I didn't listen to all of it because, like the rest of the American people, I have other things that I must do every day. But I've listened to the great majority of what was said that day, and every one of those four professors, Noah Feldman, Pamela Carlin, Michael Gerhardt, and Jonathan Turley, said really extraordinary things. They were articulate. They were concise. They knew their Constitution. They're brilliant constitutional scholars. They didn't always agree, which tells you that there is no hard and fast, settled once and for all interpretation of the impeachment clause of the United States Constitution. It was a great civics lesson, and I think that the tapes of those conversations could be used in law schools and in political science courses in this country for decades to come.
Undoubtedly, they will be. Let's start with Jonathan Turley, who was a bit outnumbered on the panel. He began talking about referencing Alexander Hamilton and expressing his thoughts about why this investigation is wrong.
We are living in the very period described by Alexander Hamilton, a period of agitated passions. We're all mad. Where has that taken us? Will a slipshod impeachment make us less mad? Will it only invite an invitation for the madness to follow every future administration? That is why this is wrong. It's not wrong because President Trump is right. His call was anything but perfect. It's not wrong because the House has no legitimate reason to investigate the Ukrainian controversy. It's not wrong because we're in an election year. There is no good time for an impeachment. No, it's wrong because this is not how you impeach an American president.
You know, David, I think he has a point here. I think that this could be seen as too hasty. The House of Representatives has chosen to proceed relatively quickly for a couple of reasons. I can come back to those. But in doing so, they have not exhausted the court tests. There are several cases moving through the federal court system requiring the president and his advisors to either submit documents according to House subpoenas or to appear in person for House testimony. And those cases have not been adjudicated yet by the U.S. court system. And so I think what Mr. Turley is saying is that it would be actually wiser to wait to see what the courts have to say about this. And once those court decisions have been made, the House of Representatives will be in a much better position to know what to do.
Let's move on to another statement by Noah Feldman. He talks about the Constitutional Convention and the impeachment clause.
It's very important what he had to say because he's talking about the historical background to the inclusion of the impeachment clause in the United States Constitution. This is a bit of a longer soundbite, but it's historically extremely important. Let's listen to it.
I would like you to think now about a specific date in the Constitutional Convention, July 20th, 1787. It was the middle of a long, hot summer, and on that day, two members of the Constitutional Convention actually moved to take out the impeachment provision from the draft Constitution. And they had a reason for that. And their reason was, they said, well, the president will have to stand for re-election. And if the president has to stand for re-election, that is enough. We don't need a separate provision for impeachment. When that proposal was made, significant disagreement ensued. The governor of North Carolina, a man called William Davey, immediately said, if the president cannot be impeached, quote, he will spare no efforts or means whatever to get himself re-elected. Following Davey, George Mason of Virginia, a fierce Republican critic of executive power, said no point is more important than that impeachment be included in the Constitution. Shall any man be above justice? He asked. thus expressing the core concern that the president must be subordinate to the law and not above the law. James Madison, the principal draftsman of the U.S. Constitution, then spoke up. He said it was, quote, indispensable that some provision be made for impeachment. Why? Because, he explained, standing for re-election was, quote, not a sufficient security, close quote, against presidential misconduct or corruption. A president, he said, might betray his trust to foreign powers. A president who, in a corrupt fashion, abused the office of the presidency, said James Madison, quote, might be fatal to the republic, close quote.
Amen. So here's the question. And as I say this, David, I don't have a settled opinion about this, but one argument was, well, we have quadrennial elections, and so if the president has abused his power, or if he's done things that are appalling to the people of the United States, every fourth year we have the opportunity to retire him. That's the ultimate vote of confidence or no confidence, and that will solve the problem. Let's just use that 4-year line of demarcation between one administration and the next as our security against a runaway executive. But several people there, including George Mason, one of the most extraordinary of all of the founding fathers, and of course the founding father himself, James Madison, said, no, we can't always wait that long. Some things have to be checked sooner than a 4-year election would permit. It's important, if we're going to be a republic, that we intervene and stop a president or other national officer from abusing the public trust. We may have to arrest his actions, and waiting what could be 3 years or 2 years or 1 year may be too long for the stability and sustainability of a Republican system of government.
You are saying if we follow the founders and the Constitution, Congress has a duty to address this and address it now.
Well, the founders decided, and there wasn't a unanimity of opinion, there probably wasn't really even consensus, that there should be an impeachment clause, and they defined it as treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And they said this has to be there. There has to be a mechanism because we may want to rid ourselves of a runaway executive sooner rather than later. We may not be able to wait until a 4-year presidential election. And so that's how the Constitution was created. That's what it says. Now the question is this one of those moments when we can't wait for an election that is, after all, coming in November of 2020? And if we do think we can't wait, have the actions of the sitting president of the United States somehow met the test of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors?
Thank you very much, Clay. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. If you're just joining us this week, we're talking about the House Judiciary Committee holding hearings on the constitutional grounds for impeaching a president, and it was held on December 4th at 10 a.m.
4 professors spoke at length, and they were all brilliant. Noah Feldman of Harvard, Pamela S. Carlin of Stanford, Michael Gerhardt of UNC, North Carolina, and Jonathan Turley, the George Washington University School of Law.
Yes, and Jonathan Turley made a comment early on in the testimony that I want to play for you now because I have a bit of an issue with it.
There's a historical moment here.
I think one of the most weighty and significant moments in constitutional history is the one that is rarely discussed, that Adams and Jefferson reached out to each other, that they wanted to reconcile before they died. And they met, and they did. And maybe that is something that we can learn from.
Maybe I'm being too picky here, but I have learned well from you, sir. Adams and Jefferson did not reach out to one another. Had it not been for a Dr. Benjamin Rush, they may not have contacted each other at all. And they, in fact, never did meet. Am I being too picky?
No, the last time they met was early March of 1801. Adams left town before Jefferson was inaugurated in his place. Jefferson resented that on several grounds. And they never saw each other again. So he's certainly wrong that they met.
Well, it doesn't necessarily change the thrust of his argument, but...
No, but you need to get it right if you're going to be a constitutional law professor making a big point at a congressional hearing of this sort, and he's certainly in a position to have known that. But more than that, you're right. It was Dr. Benjamin Rush who said to both of them, you need to work this out. He called them the North Pole and the South Pole of the American Revolution. And finally, Adams did. Adams did reach out at Rush's suggestion on the first day of January 1812, and then he and Jefferson exchanged 140-some letters in the last 14 years of their life. And in his fifth or sixth letter, Adams did say, "We must not die until we have explained ourselves to each other. We must not die until we have explained ourselves to each other." And a few letters later, Jefferson said, "I agree. On your principle that we must not die till we have explained ourselves to each other, I want to respond to," and it was a question about the Senate and aristocracy.
The point is made. And like I say, I don't think it fundamentally changed the weight of his argument or his statement. But
it gets
you just can't play fast and loose with things like that.
He wasn't too fast and he wasn't too loose. But here's the important point, that these scholars didn't just argue what they felt. They went back to the Constitution, the text of it. They went to Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. They went to the Federalist Papers, which were written by Jay and Madison and Hamilton, which were the first great exposition of the points of the United States Constitution. They went to some of the debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists at the time. In other words, they did their homework.
And they also went to Samuel Johnson, the dictionary of his.
I love that, and my essay today is about that very subject.
Well, there was a great deal of discussion about the definition of bribery, and it started with Professor Carlin. Let's play that.
Counsel for the minority read Samuel Johnson's definitions of high and crime and misdemeanor. He didn't read the definition of bribery. I have the 1792 version of Johnson's dictionary. I don't have the initial one. And there he defines bribery as the crime of giving or taking rewards for bad practices. And so if you think it's a bad practice to deny military appropriations to an ally that have been given to him, if you think it's a bad practice not to hold a meeting to buck up the legitimacy of a government that's on the front line, and you do that in return for the reward of getting help with your reelection, that's Samuel Johnson's definition of bribery.
Well, maybe. It feels a bit like a stretch. Let's listen to Jonathan Turley's response.
The statement has been made, not just by these witnesses, but Chairman Schiff and others, that this is a clear case of bribery. It's not. The bribery theory being put forward is as flawed in the 18th century as it is in this century. Bribery was not this overarching concept that Chairman Schiff indicated. Quite to the contrary, the original standard was treason and bribery. That led Mason to object that it was too narrow. If bribery could include any time you did anything for personal interest instead of public interest, if you have this overarching definition, that exchange would have been completely useless.
Well, I don't agree with that either. The question here is what is a bribe? And when we think of a bribe, we think, I'll give you $100,000 if you will perjure yourself at my criminal trial. I think the good sense test is not going to pass with the American people. It might pass with constitutional theorists, but it will not pass with the American people unless an actual bribe of the kind we commonly think about was in question. Let's hear from Noah Feldman on this question.
Right. He said bribery had a clear meaning to the founders, and that also that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land.
Certainly, that's true.
Bribery had a clear meaning to the framers. It was when the president, using the power of his office, solicits or receives something of personal value from someone affected by his official powers. And I want to be very clear. The Constitution is law. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So, of course, Professor Turley is right. You wouldn't want to impeach someone who didn't violate the law. But the Constitution, the supreme law of the land, specifies bribery as a ground of impeachment as it specifies other high crimes and misdemeanors. Bribery had a clear meaning.
All right, well, fair enough. Personally, I think this is something of an academic argument. I would have said
Well,
more.
they are academics.
But that's not going to help the American people decide. Ultimately, this is going to depend not on the Senate, but on the American people. And if the American people think that President Trump's behavior was unacceptable, they will put sufficient pressure on their senators that will be reflected. If the American people are going to shrug on this, or they're going to just descend into their tribalism, then we all know what the Senate vote is going to be. I would characterize it more as coercive on the part of President Trump, even almost a form of blackmail. You want your money? You want to save your country from Russian military attack? Well, I have a favor to ask, though. Or it might even be seen as a sort of ultimatum. You want my help? Here's what I'm expecting from you.
Well, and he sort of had the president of Ukraine in a tough spot. I mean, the $391 million that was promised to them in military aid, as my understanding, would represented about 10% of their defense budget. So it was a tough position. But
that doesn't sound like a bribe to me. I know that I understand what those professors are saying, but it's technical and it's abstract, and I don't think it's going to resonate with the American people. But if you say, I'll give you your money if and only if you give me what I want, a classical quid pro quo, that I think makes sense to people.
Well, let's be fair and give Professor Turley, who really was outnumbered that day, the last word on bribery. He makes an interesting reference to President Washington in this quote.
I just want to note a couple things. First of all, I do find it rather surprising that you would have George Washington in this jury pool. I would strike him for cause. George Washington was the first guy to raise extreme executive privilege claims. He had a rather robust view of what a president could say. If you were going to make a case to George Washington that you could impeach over a conversation he had with another head of state, I expect his powdered hair would catch on fire. Also, I just want to know one other thing, which may explain part of our difference. The statutes today on bravery are written broadly, just like they were back then. That was my point. The meaning of those words are subject to interpretation. They're written broadly because they don't want them to be too narrow. That was the case in the 18th century as they are today. But the idea that bad practices could be the definition of bribery, really?
Well, I'm going to leave the bribery argument alone here and go back to his historical reference to President Washington. Yes, Washington had a robust sense of executive sovereignty and separation of powers and so on. But if George Washington could be told the facts in this case, I feel absolutely certain he would say that is precisely what we founding fathers wanted to make sure could not happen in a society. If you call on foreign nations to interfere in your electoral process for the purpose of maintaining the incumbent in office and either finding fault against his principal rival or pretending that you're going to find fault against him, that is 100% what we founding fathers wanted to make sure could never, ever happen in this our happy republic. So I think that Jonathan Turley is being disingenuous here. I think he's scoring easy points, but he's missing the fundamental issue, which is that when impeachment was being bruited about by the founding fathers, both at and after the Constitutional Convention, it was to prevent foreign interference in the sacred business of American elections that they were principally concerned with.
And to amplify your point, let's go to Professor Carlin. She talks about how the founders were particularly worried about foreign interference in government.
The founding generation, like every generation of Americans since, was especially concerned to protect our government and our democratic process from outside interference. For example, John Adams, during the ratification, expressed concern with the very idea of having an elected president, writing to Thomas Jefferson that you are apprehensive of foreign interference, intrigue, influence. So am I. But as often as elections happen, the danger of foreign influence recurs. And in his farewell address, President Washington warned that history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. And he explained that this was in part because foreign governments would try and foment disagreement among the American people and influence what we thought. The very idea that a president might seek the aid of a foreign government in his reelection campaign would have horrified them.
I'm with her. I'm afraid. I think that Pamela Carlin is a better reader of George Washington's views than Jonathan Turley is here.
And a passionate informant.
You know, I want to say a couple of things about this. First of all, I take absolutely no joy in any of this. I regard this as a national catastrophe, a tragedy. This is going to further divide this country. Nothing good is going to come of this, I'm afraid. I feel heartbroken and crestfallen and disillusioned and depressed to think that it has come to this and that it is falling out on such nakedly partisan lines. But at the same time, I'm amazed that these four scholars came before the House of Representatives and spoke with such erudition and invoked the Founding Fathers again and again and again and talked about the intention and the debates and the Federalist Papers and Hamilton's view and Madison's view and George Mason's view and others, letters between Jefferson and Adams. This is a civics lesson that we have not had for a very long time in this country. And even though one might quibble with what one or more of them said, there was a little stridency in a couple of them, and there were a couple of cheap shots here and there, and some of the arguments appeared to me to be partisan and not motivated by pure intellectuality or historical scrutiny. Even so, this was rich, rich material. And to hear that Dr. Johnson, the great Samuel Johnson, was, here's what Jefferson would say to that. He would say, why are you quoting from Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language? Jefferson did not like Dr. Johnson, and he would have said, well, it was a little early, but from hindsight, he would have said, how about Noah Webster? He's an American lexicographer. Why isn't anybody quoting from Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language? Because it's America that we're talking about here, not British common law.
It was an interesting exchange. I remember Professor Turley came back and commented on Professor Carlin and was quite impressed that she had a copy of Johnson's dictionary.
So was I, because I was...
But I need to come back to you and your pessimism and offset that a bit, if I might.
But may I first say
Please,
just about Johnson that when I heard this, I perked up because I love Dr. Johnson. I've read all of Johnson. I've read Boswell. My father and I spent years of our lives talking about Johnson and Boswell. I have several copies of Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language. I was amazed that Dr. Johnson would come up. I've been to his house in London recently with my daughter. I've seen his statue recently on the Strand in London. So Johnson is this huge figure in my own life, but almost never invoked, particularly on questions from his dictionary, and I just thought that was pure delight. But what she said when the other one said, "Wow, you're quoting Dr." and then she said, "It's the online edition," and my heart sank because I wanted her to say, and I have in my attaché case this giant folio volume, but she said, "No, it's the online edition."
The point was made; it was good. Anyway, to your pessimism, to offset it with a bit of optimism, I heard a statistic the other day where somewhere near half of the American public can't even identify the three branches of government. You hear stuff like that and you're just devastated. But, maybe let's think that this whole process is a bit of an awakening, at least for some citizens, on how government works, what it's supposed to do. And as you said, it's a great civics lesson.
I agree, David. I wish someone would empower us to create a 1-hour encapsulation of the arguments and to provide a little commentary before and after each one, because if the American people are not going to listen to 12 hours of this, nor should they necessarily, because what everyone had to say can be digested into a pretty short order. And if something were put together that said, Americans, as you think about the impeachment of Donald Trump, whether you're for it or against it, take the time to listen to these four extraordinarily important constitutional historians try to elucidate what the Founding Fathers meant by the impeachment clause, that would be one of the greatest services that we could do for this country, and it would be one of the greatest things the American people could do to get ready for this catastrophe that we're now descending into.
Well, there's a couple of points left to be made, I think, and then it's the argument comes down to Turley saying there are no crimes here, and it's the other three saying that his refusals and his actions are in fact a crime.
Well, next week we're going to do another program on this subject, but
talking
focusing
to Jefferson,
on
right?
to Jefferson about
right.
the two impeachments of from the judicial branch of government that occurred under his watch. And what's interesting, David, is that this debate is as old as the country, because when Samuel Chase, the Justice of the Supreme Court, was being impeached in 1804 and early 1805, one of the arguments against removing him from the Supreme Court was that he had not committed any crime.
Really?
He might have abused his office. He might have done awful things. He might have been a bully. He might have been a rotten guy. He might even have made some judicial mistakes in his rulings from the bench. But, said his defenders, unless it's an indictable crime, it is not an impeachable offense. I repeat, unless it is an indictable crime under American criminal law, they said it can't, therefore, be an impeachable offense.
Well, that's really the bottom line of the argument, isn't it?
Well, that's one argument. The other argument is, no, it can't be that narrow. Massive abuse of your trust is in itself a quote-unquote crime against America. It might not be on the statute books, but you have to be able to get rid of somebody who is in fundamental ways abusing the trust the American people have given him.
Well, it's a political mindset. We have professional politicians who understand that, and now we have somebody who has no experience in that, and it's business as usual.
Well, we will find out. My point is, as we close this portion of the program, is that there is confusion at the very center of the idea of an impeachment, and we're going to live through that confusion now for a couple of hard months.
Right now, we're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
One of the disagreements that we have, and I have with my esteemed colleagues, is what makes a legitimate impeachment, not what technically satisfies an impeachment. There's very few technical requirements of an impeachment. The question is, what is expected of you? And my objection is that there is a constant preference for inference over information, for presumptions over proof. That's because this record hasn't been developed. And if you're going to remove a president, if you believe in democracy, if you're going to remove a sitting president, then you have an obligation not to rely on inference when there's still information you can gather. And that's what I'm saying. It's not that you can't do this. You just can't do it this way.
Welcome back, everyone, to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, sitting across from David Swenson here in the studio of the New Enlightenment Radio Network in Bismarck, North Dakota. That was Jonathan Turley, and his argument is that we're rushing here and that we don't have enough actual irrefutable evidence in place, and that we can only get that evidence by seeing through the court tests, which would force the Trump administration to hand over the documents in question and to supply to the House Impeachment Committee the operatives, the chief of staff, John Bolton, other members of the administration who should come forward, who were there, who are eyewitnesses, who know what happened, who know the pattern of things that have happened in this administration and could be called under oath to testify. His view is we don't have enough in place yet to make this a sufficiently legitimate impeachment to stand historically and not seem to be a partisan event.
Throughout these hearings, Turley had sort of a tone that, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it was always sort of a pleading tone, as if he needed to overemphasize because he himself wasn't sure of his own arguments. Feldman talked about how he didn't think the framers could imagine a president refusing to cooperate.
Let's hear it.
Sir, I don't even think the framers could have imagined that a president would flatly refuse to participate in an impeachment inquiry, given that they gave the power of impeachment to the House of Representatives and assumed that the structure of the Constitution would allow the House to oversee the president.
I agree with that. I think that Feldman is right, Noah Feldman of Harvard Law, that we do have a system of checks and balances, and the impeachment power is clearly part of the Constitution. We've heard today that there was a significant debate about that at the Constitutional Convention, and that it comes up in the Federalist Papers, that this isn't some sort of accidental clause that was tossed in without proper vetting, that the Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that each branch could check the excesses of the other. And in this case, the House, with its oversight function, is wanting to examine the materials, the kind of communications that occurred within the Trump White House, within the administration, about this Ukrainian matter, and the White House has refused. The White House has a right to refuse, in my opinion, but then it goes to the courts, as it did in the case of Richard Nixon, and the courts will then decide whether the doctrine of executive privilege covers this set of communications or whether it doesn't. And the courts have a long, distinguished, nonpartisan record of protecting the Constitution against the excesses of the other two branches. And so I'm with Jonathan Turley that we probably should wait for that.
But a point that's been brought out during this testimony is that the White House has refused to cooperate. What about that?
That's the point that Turley's making. If the courts said emphatically the president must turn over these documents and that he must make available members of his administration under oath, and then the administration refused to comply, if they were in direct defiance of a federal court order, possibly one coming from the Supreme Court itself, then Turley's argument would be now you have grounds for impeachment because two branches have agreed that these documents and these individuals must come forth. That means that it's not just the Democrats in the House of Representatives. It is two fundamental branches of the United States government that are in agreement about what the president, what the executive must do, irrespective of the facts in the case.
There's one more quote from Feldman that I'd like to play before we close this part of the conversation. But for people listening into this, for our Jefferson Hour listeners, can you short story it? I mean, what should we take away from all of this?
We should take away first that there is it's unsettled, that there is a lively, ongoing debate about what is an impeachable offense, and there is honest disagreement by the most brilliant scholars in our system about what impeachment means, when it should be applied, and whether this situation rises to the level of the impeachment of a president. That's number one.
Do you think Congress is overstepping their bounds?
No. But I think that Nancy Pelosi and Jerry Nadler said a few months ago, the worst thing that could happen is if there's a merely partisan impeachment, that it has to be bipartisan, that both parties, both houses need to agree that it's a legitimate inquiry. That doesn't mean the president is convicted. It doesn't mean that he's acquitted, but that there needs to be some sense that this is the will of Congress, not just the will of the Democrats in Congress. And unfortunately, that's where things now are.
I worry about precedent. I worry about what this means for future presidents, both good and bad, what's going to happen to the powers of that office.
I agree. And as you will hear in my Jefferson Watch essay this week, if we were a republic, we wouldn't be having this conversation because we would be so prickly about abuses of power by the executive that we would have kept them on a very narrow path for hundreds of years. And we have not, especially in the post-World War II period.
But to be a republic requires participation, sir.
And that's why this is so important. These four scholars did not exhaust the subject by any means, but they provided an absolutely essential civics lesson for every American. And I just ask everyone who's listening, take some time, go to YouTube or however you want to get access to these things, and listen to the heart of each person's argument. You can skip around if you need to, but it won't take long to understand what each of these four extraordinarily important scholars had to say about this subject, and then discuss it with your friends at dinner parties, on your deck if you live in the American South, in your igloo if you live here in North Dakota, but discuss it with the people around you, because this is, we have not gotten a civics lesson like this in my lifetime.
Let's let Mr. Feldman give his final word, sir.
Of course.
It's crucial to note that the victim of a high crime and misdemeanors, such as the president's alleged to have committed, is not President Zelensky and is not the Ukrainian people. The victim of the high crime and misdemeanor is the American people. Alexander Hamilton said very clearly that the nature of a high crime and misdemeanor is that they are related to injuries done to the society itself. We, the American people, are the victims of the high crime and misdemeanor. The framers created one remedy to respond to high crimes and misdemeanors, and that was impeachment.
Hamilton. I hate to see that, David, that Hamilton in some sense is going to get the last word on this subject. The vile Colonel Alexander Hamilton, that monarchist.
But he has a point.
No, he does. And of course, the Federalist Papers are a magnificent explication of the intent of the United States Constitution. We should all be reading them, particularly those beginning with around number 60. But I'm with Mr. Feldman. I believe the professor is right that what's on trial here is not Donald Trump. He's not the only one who's behaved in an extra-constitutional way, although his own manner is unique, I would say. Mm-hmm. But what's on trial here is the American Republic, and the question is, do we or do we not want to try to be a republic in the 21st century? And if not, Katie, bar the door is all I can say.
Thank you so much, Clay. And it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thank you, David. What do you do when Republicans refuse to take seriously what they would find absolutely appalling and outrageous, criminal and treasonous, disgusting and Constitution-threatening if it were done by a liberal Democrat president? We all know that if the situation were reversed and Barack Obama had reached out to Pakistan to demand that they pretend to investigate Jeb Bush or Donald Trump, the Republicans would be having what used to be called a conniption fit, and we'd be in a constitutional crisis at least as severe as this one. If you're going to argue that Donald Trump may be a vulgar schnook, well, we all knew that, and this is just one more unseemly episode, but it's not worth bringing the country to a halt for a couple of months over this, I can understand that. I was actually quite taken by some of Jonathan Turley's arguments in the House Judiciary televised hearings on December 4th. What's the rush? He asked. The Trump administration has refused to comply with House subpoenas both for documents and for administrative witnesses on the grounds of executive privilege and separation of powers. The House of Representatives has initiated court proceedings designed to bring the U.S. federal court system into ordering Trump to comply. That would enlist a second of the three branches of the national government into this crisis. I do think the House should see the court cases through, because I believe the country needs the legal imprimatur of the U.S. Judiciary to force President Trump to turn over the documents the House needs and to permit administrative officials to testify before Congress. If the courts reaffirm that no president can ignore legal subpoenas and that congressional oversight is not only legitimate but essential to the maintenance of the checks and balances that are at the heart of our constitutional system, that would do four things. It would show that the impeachment investigations are not just partisan machinations. It would show that the referee branch of our national government, the judiciary, endorses both the legitimacy and the importance of congressional oversight and investigation. It would either bring President Trump to comply with clear federal court orders, or, if he defied the rulings of the courts, it would confirm the lawlessness of his administration and thus bring much more legitimacy to the process. I agree with Professor Turley. This is so grave that there is no hurry. If this is worth doing, it is worth doing right, because impeachment is that grave. Thomas Jefferson tried to impeach a couple of high Federalist members of the U.S. Judiciary. When Samuel Chase was acquitted after his Senate trial, Jefferson threw up his hands and said impeachment is a bungling way of dealing with bad federal judges, and he desisted for the remainder of his time as president. It should tell us something that in the previous 3 impeachment episodes in American history, Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton, not one has ended in conviction and removal by the United States Senate. Getting a 2/3 majority to remove even a person of undisputed corruption, a person manifestly unfit for high office, is probably too high a bar ever to succeed, even if that person shot someone on Fifth Avenue. And if that event occurred, there are, I believe, people in the House of Representatives who would apparently say, A, that never happened in spite of the live video footage, B, the edited White House version of the video is the one we should be using, C, the guy the president killed was known to be corrupt and all the president was doing was trying to end corruption in New York City, D, whatever the president does must be legal under the theory of the unitary executive, E, okay, he may have done a bad thing, but it doesn't qualify under the historically specific meanings of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. F, there's an election coming. Let the voters decide if it's okay to shoot a man down in the streets of Manhattan. And G, this is a witch hunt. I thought Bill Clinton should resign when the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. I thought President Reagan should be pressured to resign over the Iran-Contra scandal when he deliberately violated a specific congressional law prohibiting providing military aid to the right-wing Nicaraguan Contras and then had everyone in his administration lie about it under oath. I thought Barack Obama should be checked for his misuse and overuse of executive orders to fill the vacuum caused by congressional stalling and inaction. It was John Adams who said nobody in America is above the law, and that includes, of course, the fundamental law of the land, the United States Constitution. Whenever this occurs, as it now routinely does, we need to come down on extra-constitutional behavior like a ton of bricks. If we did that from time to time and at least passed a vote of censure in the United States Senate and maybe removed a few of these self-aggrandizing presidents, we would be more like a republic. If you want to argue that they all do it, that the Constitution ratified in 1788 is no longer a strictly enforceable guide to public behavior, that it is in fact a little bit quaint in a world of cyber warfare and globalism, okay, but then say farewell to the rule of law. I may be naive, but I would think pressuring a foreign nation to meddle in our next national presidential election would constitute a slam-dunk impeachable offense. If not this, what is an impeachable offense? I'm with the cautious law scholars and with Nancy Pelosi and Jerry Nadler in their more cautious moods that a strictly partisan impeachment in which not a single Republican vote for any one of the articles makes things worse rather than better in our already broken-down constitutional system. Impeachment needs to be bipartisan, at least to a certain extent. I don't understand why a few dozen Republicans don't do publicly what we know they are doing privately, that is, acknowledge that what the president has done is appalling and impeach-worthy. But if they don't, or won't, I think maybe we had better wait for the election. And impeachment needs to have legitimacy. It needs to command a supermajority. That's why the founders said removal requires 2/3 of the Senate, a high bar then, and an impossible bar now. A legitimate impeachment needs to be bipartisan, fair enough. But it's the hypocrisy that kills me. We all know those same Republicans would be slathering for impeachment if the situation were reversed. Does anybody doubt that? I'm serious. Does anybody really doubt that? So if we follow my logic here, we must accept what it signifies, that the American Republic is dead. If we were a republic, there would be scores of Republicans who would vote their conscience rather than political expediency and partisan solidarity on this issue. What we are witnessing, and some will even admit it, is the strategy of political survival rather than justice or due process. The desire to survive the next election matters more to them than the United States Constitution. Power matters more than principle. Don't get me wrong. I think it might be similar if the situation were reversed, but remember back when Bill Clinton was impeached. A large number of Democrats publicly condemned his behavior, acknowledged that he had violated his oath and damaged this country, demanded that he show contrition, and he did, even contemplated the idea of a vote of censure against him in the United States Senate. I don't see any of that yet amongst today's Republicans. I have lost respect for them, therefore. And unless you are just an absolute Trumpite, or unless you are just nakedly partisan, you have lost respect for them too. At the end of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin was asked, "Well, what have you given us here?" He said, "A republic, if you can keep it." I am watching us blithely toss that republic into the sewer. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.